Welcome to How I Raised It, the podcast that goes behind the scenes with entrepreneurs who've raised capital. We uncover the tips, tricks, and techniques they use to get investors to write a check. Strap in and turn it up.
Hi, welcome to another episode of How I Raised It, produced by Foundersuite.com. Today I have Alex Kubicek of Understory Weather coming to us from Madison, Wisconsin. How's your day going, Alex?
It's going great. It's not too cold today in Wisconsin, December.
I was just in Iowa 2 days ago, and it was pleasant. It was really nice. It was actually great weather. I guess This is something you're familiar with, the weather patterns and global warming, perhaps, or just a nice warm winter.
I mean, if winters would always be this nice, be a lot more bearable to live up here.
Yeah. I did live in Illinois for 1 year, and I grew up in Colorado, which, you think snow, mountains, cold. But the 1 year in Illinois I lived was the coldest, bitterest winter I've ever experienced. It was something different.
Yeah. When you get down to negative 40 below wind chill, it's an experience.
For sure. Do you do ice fishing or any of that sort of stereotypical Wisconsin winter fun? Snowmobiling?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you got to do something to, spend your time during the long winters here, because it takes, it's about 6 or 7 months of winter.
Very good. All right, let's get into it. So what do you do? Speaking of weather, what do you do? What does Understory do?
Yeah, so at Understory, what we do is we assess the impact of weather and atmospheric conditions inside a city, so we can help communities and businesses utilize the ground truth data to better understand how weather is impacting them and what to do about that. Because when you think about the current weather data that you're getting out of your weather apps, it's using radar and satellite, which is looking up at the sky, but not really what's happening on the ground. And so that's good enough to tell you if you need a sweater or you need an umbrella, but it's not enough to actually make real business decisions or any decisions that have any impact with the weather. It's just nowhere near accurate. And so that's why I created Understory, is so that we can define that information, provide it to people and businesses so they can make those types of decisions. And so we do that through deploying and operating ruggedized networks throughout a city that are maintenance free. So they basically last for over 10 years, and allows us to use a pun from my company's name, tell the story under the clouds.
Story under the clouds. Oh, that makes sense. Interesting. And so these are, what's the form factor here? How big are these data collection devices?
Yeah, so they're about 2 feet tall, and we put them on top of commercial buildings. And so it essentially allows us to measure the weather every 2 to 3 miles throughout a city. And then we have our Fusion AI that takes all that data and maps it together so we can actually understand what's happening at every point throughout a city. And we've tested that with insurance companies from across the United States and found that we have 95% litigation quality data at every single point inside our network.
Yeah, that was my next question, is like, who's the customer? It sounds like insurance companies, weather services, or more businesses?
More so businesses. So insurance companies, they use this information to understand how their policyholders are impacted after a storm. And then we're also live in Argentina, helping farmers actually understand how the weather's impacting their fields so they can make irrigation decisions or better decisioning around when to actually harvest. And that's really important because you need to actually position a lot of equipment when you're doing the harvest. And basically understanding how close that is within a week really allows you to pinpoint that and potentially have much better yields.
So is it predictive? Is there a predictive angle too? Or is it more just, here's what's happening in real time and here's how to use that data, or both?
It's a little bit of both, but mostly the low-hanging fruits around actually measuring what happened, because most of the time people and businesses don't actually know what happened. And so having that information, like for instance, after a storm moves through an area, through a city, it damages a lot of buildings, and the insurance companies basically just wait by the phone for you to call and file a claim. They have no idea if your home is actually damaged or not until Understory came along.
And so an insurance company is using this to give me a scenario there.
Yeah, so let's say a large hailstorm is moving throughout an area. So we had a $2 billion hailstorm in Denver, Colorado, about a couple of years ago. And so essentially what happened is the storm pushed through the city, and we measured over 5,000 individual hailstones, which we stitched together to actually create a map of understanding the distribution of hail throughout the city. And so based on how our sensors actually measure that hail, is that we knew exactly what angle and how hard that hail was hitting a building. So we can tell you exactly what buildings were damaged. And so one of the major problems in the US because of climate change, but also because of the recession that happened 10 years ago, is that the contracting industry, the roofing industry, is creating a lot more repairs than actually need to happen. And so we found across the insurance industry is that on average, insurance companies are seeing about 20-25% fraud. We've seen it as high as 40% fraud. And so by having that information, we allow them to combat fraud and allow them to lower rates across the country.
Yeah, I was going to guess that. Insurance companies are using this to battle fraud. Farmers are using it to kind of optimize their operations. Cool. Any other big use cases?
Yeah, and the other thing that we're really excited about, and I was going to plug this more towards the end, is we added air quality to our networks as well. So cities are using that to actually understand how to actually reduce emissions, because you saw with COP24 the past week, one of the big things that they were talking about was how do you actually measure those emissions, report those emissions, and how that's done is just kind of like, well, we understand kind of what energy is being produced and kind of the general traffic, so let's estimate the emissions, but there hasn't really been a way to actually measure it. And so with our network, we're actually enabling those cities to see what steps they're taking to actually reduce those emissions. So, if they take a diesel ban, for instance, or if they are issuing tolls or blocking different parts of the city off to basically improve the air quality, they can actually see what impact that has on emissions and actually allow the city to slowly reach their emission goals, which are really important for basically slowing a warming planet.
And what sort of coverage do you have in the U.S.? Can you blanket the whole U.S. or do you certain cities and regions?
Yeah, so it depends on the actual application. So right now we're live in 5 cities. And in the US, our largest network is in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, where we have about 150 weather stations across the entire area. It's the most comprehensive weather network that exists. And that has allowed us to basically understand those different weather patterns. And we actually use the information that we learned from our Dallas network to basically understand how to improve weather data throughout the entire country. With agricultural regions, it then depends on the growing region, what type of crops. And so we basically map the infrastructure to the value that we're creating with the end customer.
I almost don't want to ask this question, but are you seeing, global warming just terrifies me in so many ways, but are you seeing you have a bird's eye view or canary in the coal mine view of this? Are you seeing anything that's not, widely reported or any surprises from what you're seeing in the data?
On the weather data, I mean, we've had the networks up for about 5 years, and you need about kind of 30 years of data to see a climate trend. So, we'll get to that data set at one point, but not enough to actually tell us anything. On the air quality side, though, we've seen a lot higher air quality problems than what's been reported, and so that's a little concerning. But that's kind of why we've created this network, is to help cities, actually manage that in a lot more effective way.
That's interesting. On the one hand, like I remember, I'm old enough to remember like when LA was just so smoggy, and even Colorado, where I grew up, had some pretty smoggy days around Denver and stuff. And, just with cleaner emissions, things have improved on that front, which is sort of encouraging.
But there's a lot of work to get to do to actually get to those. I think they want to do 40% emissions in the next 15 years. So, taking that down is it's going to take a lot of work. Great.
Well, this is a cool space. Yeah, one of the coolest startup stories I've heard recently was a sail drone. I think their company was called Sail Drone, that was sending out autonomous sailing drones into the ocean to collect weather data. I guess, do you have any connection to those guys, or just do you follow that story?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, because the same thing it's very similar to our business, where essentially, there's not a lot of information about how weather's actually functioning on kind of the ocean level. We have sensors that are these buoy sensors that have basically fallen into disarray. So they're solving a huge data gap in that aspect to help with maritime. So it's very similar to our business, except we're land based.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's talk about fundraising. So how much have you guys raised over how many rounds?
Yeah, so we've raised over 17 million over 3 rounds. Most of that's come from venture capitalists.
And what was let's take it chronologically. Was the first one just a seed round from VCs? And what did you have back in the early days?
Yeah, so that was 2.1 million. That was led by True Ventures back in, I want to say 2014.
What were you doing before this, or where did this idea come from? Because I think this is an interesting idea. I'd love to hear the quick backstory.
Yeah, so my general passion in the weather started when I did Hurricane Katrina cleanup in 2005. So I was essentially went down to help with basically cleaning out buildings that have been, seen about like 8 or 10 feet of floodwaters to basically keep them from molding out. And then, just by looking around the city and the devastation that was caused, it kind of hit me upside the head that, we really don't understand these weather risks as much as we should to actually be resilient as society. And so I started researching. I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison to research atmospheric science, and I was working on something called cloud microphysics, which is the study of how particles interact with each other inside the sky to cause thunderstorms to grow or shrink. And essentially, what we were doing is we were trying to help with short-term forecasting, so longer lead times on tornadoes, hailstorms, and so on. But the problem is that no matter how good our algorithms actually became, there was no data to actually validate them. We had one data set from 1982, and that wasn't really enough to actually validate them. So I created Understory to solve that data gap, and we've seen similar data gaps in air quality as well. And so I started that company out of Madison, and you talk about basically trying to raise capital at that time. So this is 2012. At the time, the investors in the area just didn't want to touch hardware. Like they weren't. I've talked to almost every single angel and angel group and venture capitalists in Wisconsin, and they just were like, no, hardware, not even going to touch it. This is too scary. So we actually had to move the company out of Madison, and we went to Boston to have a better opportunity for raising money on the coasts. And that's where we actually through networking essentially were able to connect with True Ventures. And why I tell that story is really interesting. It has kind of a connection to our latest round. So our main investor that came in with this round is Revolution or Rise of the Rest. And if you're not familiar with that, that's Steve Cases. He's the founder of AOL, and he basically created this fund that would help startups in the middle of the country be able to find capital. So it's relatively easy to find capital in the coasts, but in the middle of the country, it's pretty tough. And so our story of trying to raise money in Wisconsin and essentially failing at that, and then having to move to the coast to actually get to that really resonated with them. And then, over the course of growing Understory, we've actually been fortunate enough to move back to Wisconsin, back to the middle of the country, because there's a huge opportunity to have great talent, great standards of living. And what I like to say is you have the ability to do really cool technology, but also have babies. So you have this tech and babies effect, which is great.
I'm in San Francisco, where prices are shockingly high, of course. And then I went to my uncle's wedding in Janesville, Wisconsin over the summer. And of course, every time I go to a new place, I drive around with Zillow app open and just like kind of what do they call war chalk or whatever, real estate prices. And it's amazing what you can get for $200K or $100K buys you a house. It's like shocking. So yeah.
My single bedroom apartment in Boston is was substantially more than the mortgage on my house in Wisconsin. So yeah, it's crazy.
You're hustling in Madison, not finding much success. And so how did you just move out to Boston and break into the startup or VC scene? Did you have connections out there? Did you literally just how'd you do it? How'd you build a network?
Yeah, I mean, it was so essentially we joined a startup accelerator called Gener8tor shortly after starting the company in Wisconsin. And it was through one of their limited partners that connected us to an investor in Boston called Bolt, which is a seed hardware fund, essentially. And so
Bolt? Both.
They invest Bolt BLT.
Both.
Yeah, so they're called Bolt because what they do is they invest in you, but at the same time they also bolt a hardware team onto your company. So because when you're launching a new hardware product, you need a lot more expertise than you typically do to actually launch a startup product. You need electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, manufacturing engineers, industrial engineers. And it's really hard for a company with very limited resources to hire all that expertise, because all those people need to have 20, 30 years experience to actually get something that quickly off the ground.
So when you were raising that, did you have a prototype of your collection device? Did you have a data set up in a city, a proof of concept, or was this more conceptual?
It was more conceptual at that point. We had a general prototype, but it was nowhere near ready for scale, and that's why we worked with them, because that is essentially what they can do, is help take your prototype and allow you to actually turn it into something that's manufacturable that can be scaled.
Did you have any market validation, or was this really just vision that you were pitching and selling to investors at this point?
We had one early customer that had bought into the vision, but nothing had been deployed yet at that point. But that was so small early market validation allowed us to secure that initial round. But it took us from starting the company to getting to that point. I think it's about 18 months. So it was a long slog to actually get to that point.
How many investors do you think you talked to for that seed round? Do you remember what your funnel looked like?
For that round, including the Wisconsin investors, probably like 30, 40 for that. And then the following the actual seed round, that was 2.1 million, was probably around 30 again. And then we raised our Series A. We were probably around 100 investors that we talked to. So, but that's being able to, talk to that many different investors has always been about networking. So that allowed us to essentially get our story in front of that, as many investors as possible.
And for the Series A, what were you pitching? I'm assuming still the vision, but did you have more of a proof of concept and prototypes? And
for the Series A, essentially what we were pitching was the proven technology and some customer proof. So we had a network live in Kansas City, showed the technology worked, it was scalable, and we were able to actually map our output to something that the customer found incredibly important.
Gotcha. And so for that, were you only going after hardware VCs again, or more broadly data VCs, or how'd you build the target list?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, mostly our target list came from, who in our network is able to provide a warm intro. And so at that, what we were looking for with the Series A wasn't actually in the hardware realm or even in the data realm, because we had built a team around actually doing that. We were looking for, more operational focused VC that, basically, someone who had been an operator at a company and had that skill set to actually help us take it from, that initial area and allow us to actually build a company that scales along with the product. So that basically allowed us to, that's why there were so many investors that we could talk to, because that fits the bill for a lot of different investors on the coast and in the middle of the country. Yeah.
And how long did Series A take? Did you have some good momentum, or was it a slog, as they often are?
I think it was between 5 and 6 months. So I think that's about standard for the Series A.
What was the hardest part about that? Was there still the objection to the fact that you're building hardware? Because that does.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, and we learned a lot from that objection. And so essentially, basically when you're selling a product, you want to qualify out as many leads as possible, so that you're not wasting your time convincing them. And so basically that's, as part of the introduction, is this interesting, this is a deep infrastructure play, deep technology play. It's not your typical SaaS company. Is that something that could be interesting to you? And what we would do also ahead of time is actually research the investors on their website, talk about people in our network about, what they've done and what their capabilities were. And then also really understanding by basically looking at their profile or their portfolio, who they invested in and what type of technologies, were they actually helping to scale.
Yeah. Okay. And then let's move forward to the more recent Series B. Did you already move back to Wisconsin first, or was it part of the deal?
No,
price of the rest?
No, we've moved. We've been in Wisconsin now for 3 years. And so we moved shortly after the Series A.
Did any of your Boston VCs or coastal VCs object to that? You know, a lot of times they like them close by, or do they get all the benefits of moving there?
I mean, it was split, to be honest. I mean, you have some investors that saw the benefits from a talent perspective as well as the runway perspective, but there were some investors that's you know, you're going to the middle of the country and that's where companies go to die essentially. And so you know, that was something that we had to essentially prove them wrong against, and we're very happy that we did.
So talk about getting in front of Rise of the Rest. I went to he did a tour, was it a year or maybe 2 years ago, and I went to it's kind of like a old style revival type show with, you know, the buses roll in, they put on a big to-do thing. And I went to it in Denver. It's a pretty interesting model what Rise of the Rest is doing. My opinion is it's brilliant because it's like arbitraging the valuation delta of startups in the middle of the country, right? You're getting good companies for a value, bargain price sometimes, which I think is really smart, right? It's just so much cheaper. But maybe how'd you identify them, or did they identify you, or how'd you get in touch with Steve Case's group?
Yeah, so we, you know, it's kind of serendipitous where I was speaking at a conference that was kind of centered around, you know, the concept of having a company in the middle of the country. So this is called the Blueprint conference that VentureBeat puts on. And so essentially, I gave a presentation about kind of why it was exciting to actually be in the Midwest, you know, with having all the, you know, access to talent from the university, as well as the standard of living and the ability to, you know, provide employees with a really good quality of life. And so, you know, that resonated with the partner that we're now working with at Revolution, David Hall, and he reached out to me and said, hey, you know, we think this is really interesting. We don't see a lot of companies that have actually left the middle of the country to go to the coast and then actually come back. But, you know, I think it's going to be a trend that'll start moving a lot faster, because actually whenever we hire for people, we see a lot of people that had either grew up in the middle of the country, moved to the coast, and are ready to actually move back for all the reasons that you described, with, you know, a much better housing market, you know, the affordability of everything that's here. So, you know, I think that's something that really resonated to what their core message is that, you know, you can actually have a really interesting company in the middle of the country.
I could almost see you making a case to potential hires considering moving there. It's like, you know, affordability and increasingly mild weather, and we have the data. Right? Look, it's going to be balmy. It's going to be like Arizona pretty soon in Wisconsin. So, bad joke, but no, that's really cool. And did you run a process for Series B? Did you talk to, you know, a lot of investors for that, or did you kind of hone in on Revolution?
So we weren't, at that point we weren't trying actively raising for a round. So, you know, that actually worked out in a way that you know, worked for everyone, where we could bring them in and then, you know, do this growth round together, which, you know, we found to be pretty refreshing after, you know, some of the initial rounds where it's kind of more of a slog.
And are they an active investor, or, you know, I really like their brand. What's it like working with them?
They're incredible. I mean, one of the main reasons, and one of the main pieces I give as advice to companies who are raising money is, when you're actually working with an investor, you know, it's not just about the cash they're bringing to the company, but it's actually, you know, what the skill set that they bring along and the network that they bring along. And so with Revolution and Rise of the Rest, you know, they have this capability to bring in talent from, you know, pretty much anywhere in the country. And so they've, you know, basically, like you said, they've built their brand touring the country and getting to know a lot of startup communities in these pockets throughout the actual country, and allows for the ability to attract new and exciting talent to different parts of the Midwest. And so we found a lot of benefit with that. And they also have, you know, fantastic connections with the government as well, which is helping with our current initiative with the atmosphere and our air quality tracking throughout the city.
Very good. All right, 1 or 2 more questions. I'll let you get back to your business. What was the hardest part about fundraising, or what would you do differently if you started the whole process all over again back in 2012?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep in mind when you're raising is that the ability to qualify investors out. If they're not, investors hate saying no. They'll always say maybe. And if you can't, you have to be able to say no for them, in a lot of different cases. So making sure that you're spending your time correctly with investors that will eventually invest versus investors that'll just let you spin your wheels. So I think that was really kind of the biggest thing for me, is that you can have a much more efficient process if you know how to actually, have the right investor with the right skill set that fits your company.
How do you do that? How do you kind of qualify them? Do you just push them enough until they tell you no, or is it more the upfront research? How do you do that?
It's some of the upfront research, and then there's also some, questions that you can ask. Have you invested in companies like this before? Is there, what has been your experience with these types of issues? And so you can understand based on their answers, because you never ask them up front, are you going to invest? And they're going to say, well, maybe. But actually knowing the right questions to ask is really important, because that helps you kind of gauge, like, is this going to be a good working relationship? And are they actually going to invest? And at a certain point, you can just put a time limit on the conversation. So if they've met with you for the 5th time and you haven't really seen any progress, then that it's probably not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. And what are typical signs you see that it's going well? Is it just more meetings, more interest, deeper?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Move as soon as you can get to a partner meeting. So typically how it goes is you meet with a partner at the investment firm, and then they escalate it to a partner meeting, and then you're talking term sheet. So as long as you can see those steps moving forward, it's just like going through a sales pipeline where you're looking for basically entrance criteria in each of those sales stages. So and most of the time, a lot of venture firms operate in the same way, so you kind of understand exactly where you are in that process.
All right. Well, congratulations on raising the most recent round. And you want to talk about, I guess, anything you want to promote? I guess it's to expand into air quality, or just generally growing the business. What's the future hold?
Yeah, so one of the new innovations that we're excited about is Atmosphere, and that's our air quality network. So we've taken our dynamic weather information and married it with our air quality information, which has given us essentially 50 by 50 meter resolution, real time, minute by minute understanding of how air quality is moving throughout a city. And so right now we're essentially looking for cities that want to be innovative, use this cost-effective technology, and to basically harness that to allow them to reduce their emissions. Because as we've talked about pretty much the entire podcast, is that climate change is coming, and we need to find ways to reduce those emissions to essentially slow the warming of the planet.
Is China a potential customer, or are they going to be doing their own thing, do you think?
Potentially. There's a lot of focus on air quality in China right now. So that's something that we've been keeping a close eye on.
All right, this is great. And if people want to learn more, it's your URL is understoryweather.com, correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. Well, Alex, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting, very fun and cool. And if you ever need a contact, if you ever want to expand to Janesville, Wisconsin, my uncle Chamber of Commerce over there, and he's always
awesome
getting businesses in. So happy to introduce you.
Well, appreciate that. And thanks again for having me on.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll catch you after your next round.
Have a good one.